Hello, BookTube. Well, it's Wednesday, and that means Epic Comic Book Wednesday, when Michael K. Vaughan and I combine the forces of stately Vaughan Manor and Hyde Cottage to talk about some comic book subject. An artist, a run, a concept, and Mike gets to pick, because originally he was doing a tour of his Epic collections at Vaughan Manor, Marvel Comics full-color reprint line, and I just horned my way in. And since I'm the interloper, he gets to pick what we talk about. And what we're talking about today is one of the newest Epic collections, the Celestials Saga, which is an Epic collection of the mighty Thor. Uh, the Epic collections do sagas, they do runs and concrete stories because, unlike the Marvel Masterworks volumes, they're not going in chronological order. I believe, I'm not sure, I haven't watched Mike's video yet, but I believe that we've had the Thor Epic Collection numbered immediately before this one and the one numbered immediately after this one for quite some time. It's weird. I think once upon a time there may have been someone at Marvel Comics that kept a master list of these things. I don't think there is anymore. But when Marvel Masterworks reprints things, they're moving in chronological order and in hardcover. So if they get to a doldrum, a bad period that any long-running book is going to have, well, they have to do it. That's their whole project, is that they have to do it. I don't understand why the Epic collections have to reprint muddled crapola. I don't know why they need to do that. They could just ignore it. But that's what this volume largely is. Muddled crapola. And there's a good reason why it's muddled. In fact, there are 3 good reasons why it's muddled. 2 of the first reasons why it's muddled fall under the heading of something that I have mentioned once or twice before on Epic Comic Book Wednesday, and that is the Stan Lee virus. When Stan Lee reinvented comic books in the early 1960s, he introduced a virus into the medium. And that virus, when a patient is sick with that virus, they show 2 symptoms. One is verisimilitude, and the other is continuity. The Stan Lee virus suddenly introduces the idea that superheroes exist in the real world, or at least that the real world in the comic books should act as if they do. That there should be verisimilitude. In other words, that if a character comes along who can lift a tank off the ground, maybe the army needs to worry about that. Maybe the citizens need to think about that. Maybe that will be reported poorly in the newspapers. It took me about a year of reading Stan Lee's Marvel Comics before I realized that that was what was making my tongue stick to the roof of my mouth, because that had not existed before. Comic books were fantasies. Obviously, there is verisimilitude goes right out the window if you're talking about, well, for instance, the adventures of a Norse god on Earth. And the other aspect of the Stan Lee virus, the other main symptom, is continuity. That suddenly, if the X-Men defeat the Mole Men in issue 13 of their comic book, in issue 20, if the Mole Men reappear, not only will they remember that they fought the Mole Men before, but the world will remember. You will be expected to remember. You will have a homework assignment. The second appearance of the Mole Men versus the X-Men will directly spring from the first one. Even down to motivations and lines of dialogue. There won't be every issue won't be a self-contained world any more than the world in every issue is any more self-contained. In ye olden days, in real comic books, if Superboy in Smallville in the 1930s faces the invasion of an alien armada, well, he fixes their wagon and he sends them off to Alpha Centauri with their tails between their legs. But no one remembers that. It's not like Earth is traumatized because Earth has finally made first contact with aliens. No, the whole world and everything in it resets for the beginning of the next story. But not in the Stan Lee virus, not in the new world of comics. Suddenly everything is freighted with backstory. This has led both companies, Marvel and DC, both major superhero companies, to at periods spasm and think there's too much continuity and undergo massive line-wide revamps of their continuity, which are always a failure because the fans ate this stuff up. They didn't care. You give them the more complicated continuity, you give them the better. So Stan Lee was right. He was absolutely right on both the main symptoms of the Stan Lee virus, both continuity and verisimilitude. Um, but even though he was right about those things, and even though they are his hallmark, he was still mostly a huckster. He was still mostly a carnival barker. I know that it seems like disrespect to his honored shade. Nobody honors Stan Lee more than I do, except maybe Michael K. Vaughan. But I don't mean it as dishonor. I just mean there's a word for what Stan Lee was at his heart. It's not a used word anymore. It's not a usable word anymore. But there's a word for what he was. Carnival barker is close enough. He wasn't quite the idea man that, for instance, Earl Stanley Gardner would be, where you're coming up with 10 ideas, or Otto Binder, where you're coming up with 10 ideas every morning, and you'll just throw them all at the script guy, and you won't care one way or another. You won't think about them tomorrow because you'll have 10 more ideas. It wasn't quite that, but it was close. It was close. Stan Lee would come up with gimmicks. There's this kid who says a magic word to get his superpowers. Hey, what if it was a god? Who's less qualified to be a superhero? Faithful marchers of merry marveldom, other than a blind guy. So what if we have a blind guy as a superhero? And that was largely where he stopped. After that, it was all soap opera melodrama. Keep in mind, this guy wrote a million more true romance novels than he ever wrote superhero stories. A million more primary color ride off into the sunset western stories than he ever wrote superhero stories. That gets in your blood, if it's not in your blood to start with. And because of that, even though continuity is a main aspect of the Stan Lee virus, things could still shard off a lot. They could still shard off a lot. Things would happen in the X-Men or in the Fantastic Four that wouldn't necessarily reverberate into the Avengers or the Hulk. Probably the biggest, most commented on example of this is in a highlight of Stan Lee's run on the Fantastic Four, where the world is threatened by an extraterrestrial creature named Galactus, who intends to eat the world. He intends to make a sandwich out of it. He is counseled about that by another almost all-powerful extraterrestrial being called the Watcher, but the Watcher is not going to interfere. The Watcher is not going to stop him. It's the Fantastic Four who have to stop him, and Galactus's former herald, the Silver Surfer, who I don't want to stress this. This is not about the revamping. This is not about the ideological capture of the Marvel Universe. I want to just remind you briefly that the next Silver Surfer on the screen will be a woman. But when that happens, in that storyline, there's no hint of the Fantastic Four. In the Fantastic Four, there's no hint of the Avengers. There's no hint of the X-Men. There's no hint of the Asgardians, for instance, who have a fond place in their heart for Thor, for the Earth. There's no hint of any of that. It's the Fantastic Four on their own. It's decades later when the artist and writer John Byrne has the prototypical Marvel superheroes band together and fight Galactus. It turns out they can make short work of him. It was a decade after that when Stan Lee has Thor on his own fight Galactus and make short work of him. So that original story never happens. Professor X, with his incredible telepathic abilities, never goes at the mind of Galactus. Doctor Strange never shunts him into another dimension. The Avengers don't fight him. He's just in those issues of the Fantastic Four, because that sharding was happening. Even though Stan Lee introduced this worship for continuity, that sharding happens anyway. That had always been a part of comic books, the ones that Stan Lee grew up reading and the ones that he orchestrated in the 60s and the early 70s. Those two things hover over the Eternals saga quite a bit. Continuity and verisimilitude, more continuity than verisimilitude, but there is one other element that hovers over this story. In fact, this story wouldn't exist without it and shouldn't have existed. And that element has a fancy name. The name is syncretism. And the only reason I'm bringing it up, Stan Lee would not have known about syncretism. That sounds like an nth dimensional power. Now, the only reason that I'm mentioning syncretism is because of Roy Thomas, the writer of these stories, who was and is still, I will always reflexively think of him as a kid in his late 20s with wispy yellow hair, but I'm sure he's 100 now. But he is and always will be the absolute reigning king of syncretism. He's also, in my opinion, the greatest comic book writer of all time. And that I'm saying that over Manly Wade Wellman, over my beloved Otto Binder, and over Stan Lee himself. And syncretism is when there is no sharding of anything. Syncretism is when you take a whole tradition, the National League, and a whole tradition, the American League, and you try to mend them together. You try to make them the same thing, or put forward a continuity in which they've always been the same thing. Roy Thomas is the king of syncretism in comic books. No one even comes close. I believe that deep down in his heart, Roy Thomas believes there is only one story, in comics or out of comics. Only one story at all. I believe that in his mind, he has tried to reconcile every science fiction story ever written as somehow being part of the same story, even though they're mutually contradictory. I'm sure he's done that with fantasy stories. I'm sure he's done that with the canon of, for instance, his beloved Robert E. Howard and a bunch of other things. You can see it. You can see it in his writing. The minute he gets a chance to start telling Conan stories, what does he do within a year? Add Elric to that continuity. They aren't part of the same thing unless you are the king of syncretism, unless you want to say that everything is connected. All stories are connected. Well, when you get to this story of the Eternals, if you have a sweet tooth for syncretism, you've got your work cut out for you. Now, the main reason that you do is because of Jack Kirby. Jack Kirby shot to fame and fortune as the main artist for Stan Lee's new revival of Marvel Comics. Unless you're talking to a actually fedora-tipping, neck-bearded quasi-fascist on YouTube, in which case they will say that Jack Kirby did all the writing, all the editing, all the lettering, all the artwork, and also oiled the cables for the elevator on Fifth Avenue. And maybe even rode the cabs. So, I'm going to hand you a script. I'm going to personally write the check that you get at the end of every week. I'm going to be responsible for the maintenance of the elevator that gets you down to the lobby. And then just to round things off, I'll ride you home. Those neck-bearded quasi-fascists all have daddy issues. That's why they're quasi-fascists to begin with. So they don't want to credit Stan Lee with anything to do with Marvel Comics. Nevertheless, in reality, Stan Lee wrote these things and Jack Kirby drew them, and that gave him a huge amount of fame. By the time the 70s rolled around, he was famous, at a time when comic book artists had not been famous on their own. And as a result, he started to be able to throw his weight around as an auteur. Jack Kirby was not an auteur. The primary evidence against the idea, the quasi-fascist fanboy idea that he wrote, that he's the guy who wrote the Renaissance of Marvel Comics, is to watch what he does when he doesn't have Stan Lee. Watch what his writing is like when he writes on his own. He went over to the competition, DC, and started creating things, and they're dumb. All the things that he created are dumb. Now, all the neck-bearded quasi-fascists who watch this channel and don't admit they do are now all screaming in their virginal high registers because I have just dissed Darkseid. I am dissing Darkseid. He's a dumb, dumb villain. But nevertheless, he's not the only thing. There are plenty of other things that Jack Kirby created for DC that were dumb. In fact, all of them were. They were other things than dumb. Some of them not very savory. Take a look at the subtext of Commandy, Last Boy on Earth, and tell me you don't see what I'm seeing. But By this point, there was no stopping that phenomenon, and the greatest reunion of all time would be for Jack Kirby to return to Marvel Comics. So he did. Now, this had some good benefits. Amazingly, I was overjoyed. I was as happy as anyone. Amazingly, comic book fans suddenly got a whole rafter of Jack Kirby comic book covers. Jack Kirby drawing these characters that he had invented. He'd invented the visuals of them. All of a sudden, he was drawing 4, 5 covers a month. That was wonderful. And none of the rest of his return to Marvel was wonderful. None of it. He was given the writing and the artist chores for Black Panther. Turned out embarrassing dreck. He was given the writing and the artist chores for Captain America. Turned out embarrassing dreck. And he was allowed to create his own comic book. The Eternals. I bought Eternals #1. Mainly because I was just assuming that it would be sharded off. I was just assuming that it would not be part of Marvel continuity. First of all, Stan Lee created the Eternals 10 years before in the Fantastic Four. Jack Kirby either forgot that the idea and the name wasn't his, or he just stole them, figuring, no, who cares? Nobody cares. I'm Jack Kirby. And second, there's no way that they could be part of Marvel's continuity, because the idea of the Eternals is that they are a superpowered race of humanoid beings, glowingly, conspicuously white humanoid beings, who were genetically engineered by aliens in a kind of Chariots of the Gods scenario, where the aliens created normal humans, they created a deviant race of monsters, none of whom are white, and they created the Eternals, who are all superpowered beings. They can fly, they can emit energy beams from their eyes. And in Eternals #1, in Eternals #2, it is explained to us that the Eternals are the source for human mythology about Olympus and the Olympian gods, or the myth of Icarus. The main Eternal that we meet is named Icarus, Ikaris. But there's also Zuras, the head of the Eternals, who is, we are supposed to believe, was Zeus. There's Circe, the character from the Odyssey. There's Athena as opposed to Athena, and so on and so forth down the line. And every Marvel fan, and I was a Marvel fan, I'm not hating Marvel. Every Marvel reader, let's just say, read Eternals #1 and Eternals #2 and thought, well, okay, isn't that interesting? I mean, it's Jack Kirby. He's the original 800-pound gorilla. You're going to let him do this, but obviously this isn't part of Marvel Comics. And why? Because we've already met the Olympian gods. We've already met Zeus and Athena. We've already met Hercules. Hercules has been in Thor and in the Avengers quite a bit. So the Olympian gods that we get from Homer and Hesiod already exist in Marvel Comics. It's not that they didn't exist and the humans mistook the Eternals for them. The Eternals are nowhere around. They're an addition here. They're a new story that Jack Kirby is just going to tell, and isn't this fun? You get all of his 1970s visuals, which are eye-popping, I admit. They're incredible. But no. I think it was issue #4 of the Eternals that has the Hulk in it. Jack Kirby very much wanted to tell the readers, to tell everybody, no, this is part of Marvel continuity. I've just introduced an entire population of superpowered beings. Now, Stan Lee did that a number of times. He did that with the Inhumans, but they're off in their own kingdom. They're not able to come into the real world. He did that with mutants, but they are hunted and feared subclass. They're a bigoted subclass. But the Eternals, they can all fly. They all have energy beams beaming out of their eyes. They're all super strong. And they've all just been here all along. It doesn't work at all. Not in the slightest. Now, what DC should have done with all the wretched creations that Jack Kirby introduced when he had his stint there, Steppenwolf, Granny Goodness, God help us. What DC should have done is when Kirby goes, just pretend that none of it ever happened. Just smile and nod and walk on and pretend that none of it ever happened, exactly like you would do if you ever found yourself married to Deb. Just smile and nod and walk on and pretend it never happened. I've done that a number of times. It works. It's the only thing that works. Marvel should have done the exact same thing. They have done the exact same thing with Kirby's era on Black Panther. They've done the exact same thing with Kirby's disastrous era on Jack Kirby. They should have done the same thing with the Eternals. Just pretend that it never happened. Of course, the Eternals don't exist in the world of Marvel Comics. They can't exist in the world of Marvel Comics. But no, Marvel decided, hey, that's that Kirby magic. There's never been any Kirby magic. Just read what he writes. It's junk. So the Eternals existed, and they lost their own book, and no one really dealt with them much, and it was just a low-key version of ignore them and walk on was happening, but not to Roy Thomas. And why? Syncretism. That's why. Because Roy Thomas can't have an idea out there that he doesn't reconcile. He can't have shard realities out there that he doesn't reconcile somehow. He knew the Eternals were out there, and he wanted to answer the question of how they could exist in Marvel continuity. But that's not the only alternate shard of reality that he also wants to syncretize in these issues. Oh God, sorry, I'm making an exegesis sermon out of a comic book video. For the fun version of this video, I will link to Michael K. Vaughan's version. I'm sure that his video will be fun. My comic book videos are never fun. But there's another element. There's another shard of Thor reality. And Roy Thomas figured, in for a penny, in for a pound. As long as I'm reconciling one version, one shard of odd reality, who were these gods? Who were these Eternals? How could they be mistaken for the Olympian gods when we know the Olympian gods exist in Marvel Comics? As long as I'm dealing with that, I might as well deal with another shard as well. And what's the other shard? Wagner. That's the other shard. Wagner. Not Norse mythology. You might think that, because the Thor and the Odin and the Asgard in Marvel Comics don't bear much reality to Norse mythology. But no, it's Wagner. It's the ring cycle. I want to stress here that very little good has ever come out of the ring cycle, out of paying it any attention. Wagner's ring cycle is probably the ultimate example of where we should all just smile and nod and walk on and pretend that it never happened. But very little good has come out of it. P. Craig Russell, the great artist, did a whole collection of adaptations of The Ring of the Nibelung. And it's brilliant. It's beautiful. So that's a good thing. Claude Erskine Brown in John Mortimer's Rumpole books. Claude Erskine Brown's two children, Tristan and Isolde. I suppose we could say they are good products of Wagner, but otherwise almost nothing. But of course, in Wagner, there's the Rheingold, and there's the gods and dwarfs and dragons, and Roy Thomas has a go at reconciling them as well in this storyline by having Odin's excised, sentient, speaking, glowing eyeball reveal to Thor that he has always been under a hypnotic delusion, and that there is a deeper history to Asgard than he thinks. Because there was an older Asgard, and it was destroyed in the process the gods know as Ragnarok. And the survivors band together in the Norse story of Ragnarok. Not everybody dies. Some gods survive. The sons of Thor survive. In this comic book version, those surviving gods see a new reborn Earth and think, well, wouldn't that be fun? They find Thor's hammer, and the sons of Thor can lift it if they work together. They find Odin's spear, and through sorcery, several of these gods combine their godly energies to become a new Odin, slightly fatter than the old one, and with two eyes instead of one. In other words, the Odin from the Marvel Comics. And that Odin creates the Asgard of the Marvel Comics with the Kirby landscapes, and with characters like Volstagg or Fandral or Hogun. These gods, Odin creates them out of excess godly energy. They don't remember anything. They don't remember an Asgard. They're just new to this world. He creates a new Asgard with a new rainbow bridge. And that is Roy Thomas's attempt to syncretize not only the reality of Norse mythology, and not only the reality of the Eternals, because of course the Eternals would be roaming around the Earth before this Asgard existed, but also the reality of the Ring of the Nibelung, of the Rheingold, and more. Because he just goes crazy with syncretization here, because the bright light, the glowing light of this new Asgard being born, you'll never guess what it is. It's the Star of Bethlehem. Keith Pollard is the artist for this thing. He was the guy who was told to draw this peyote fever dream. We see that glowing Asgard is the star over the manger in Bethlehem. Because it's all one story. As far as Roy Thomas is concerned, it's all one story. Everything is just one story. He can bring it all together. He can make it all work so that in his world, Batman and the Shadow live in the same reality. In his world, I guarantee you, in his world, the Justice Society of America and the All-Star Squadron live in the same world. The Invaders and the Justice Society live in the same world. He's just never had the rights to do it. That's all. But if you're going to syncretize the Eternals in that way, if you're going to bring them in, and he does, these pages are just full of poor Keith Pollard drawing not only the see, there's Zeus and Zuras. He draws not only the pantheons of Norse mythology and Greek mythology, but all of the Eternals as well. But if you're going to syncretize the Eternals, if you're going to bring them into Marvel Comics and try to explain why they were always here, well, you can't pick and choose, because the Eternals existing, ancient gods genetically manipulating human beings to create superpowered beings, they're not alone. They're part of a larger crappy story that Kirby came up with, that he stole from Eric von Däniken, that he stole from Chariots of the Gods. And a big part of that story are extraterrestrial beings called Celestials, who are returning to Earth in just a few decades to judge whether or not to destroy it. Thumbs up or thumbs down. Obviously, such beings do not exist in Marvel continuity. Obviously, Odin and Zeus and the Watchers and Galactus and a whole bunch of other people would have mentioned them, and certainly would not put up with them. To say nothing of the fact that Reed Richards would know about them. Tony Stark would know about them. All the extraterrestrial visitors that have come to Earth in the first 30 years of Marvel Comics would know about them. No, the Celestials obviously can't exist in Marvel continuity. Again, the thing to do here is to smile and nod and walk on and pretend it never happened. Don't use it again. Don't refer to it. Just pretend it never happened. It was junk. Most fans would be okay with you pretending that it never happened. But instead, Roy Thomas has to bring in the Celestials as well, and retcon a whole bunch of stuff from Thor's continuity into that storyline. Well, Odin must have known that the Celestials were coming, and that's why he made the superpowered armor known as the Destroyer. He must have known that the Celestials were coming, and that's why he made the Odin sword. No, we don't know why he did any of those things. We're told when the Destroyer is first introduced, don't the Destroyer in the first Thor movie fool you. The Destroyer in the comic books is unbeatable, except when he's beaten in these issues. We're told in the issues that introduce him that Odin created that suit of armor as a defense against Ragnarok, not against the Celestials. Nevertheless, Roy Thomas looks around and thinks, how can I make this into one story? Well, if I'm including the Celestials, if I'm including the Eternals, I have to include the Celestials, so I'll do that. So all of a sudden we've got these things in Marvel continuity when they shouldn't be. This was all just a self-contained thing on Kirby's part. Fine, let him do it. And don't use it anymore. Now, I would suffer myself if we did that, because the character of Circe, one of the Eternals that Jack Kirby introduces, plays a pivotal role in a really good era of the Avengers. I think you could probably come up with an alternate origin for her, and pretty quick too. I don't think you would need to do much with Kirby's creations, but nevertheless, I'm willing to lose that era in order to lose all the rest of this junk. But no, instead, you've got Zuras and Zeus fighting each other. You've got Athena and Athena fighting each other. You've got Makari and Mercury fighting each other. And then you've got the whole lot of them dealing with the Celestials and a floating eyeball. The only good thing in the epic collection that Marvel came out with here is a Thor annual that I've shown you before, where Thor participates in the Trojan War. And the only reason that that story exists is because the writer, I'll give you two guesses who the writer is, wanted to have Thor face off against Zeus. And it's very satisfying. It's drawn by John Buscema. It's not very well inked, but it's drawn by John Buscema, and it demonstrates beyond what had to be true anyway. It demonstrates beyond any doubt that not only is Zeus far more powerful than Thor, but that he can handle Thor's hammer. We all know Odin put an enchantment on Thor's hammer that only worthy people could lift it, but come on. Zeus is Odin's brother in power and age and whatnot. He can ignore enchantments like that, and he does. And it's pretty satisfying. Those 2 or 3 pages in the issue are pretty satisfying. But the rest of this is the perils of both the Stan Lee virus and syncretism taken to manic levels. Just manic, insane levels. I'm willing to forgive it. I'm willing to forgive Roy Thomas anything because of how many great comics he has produced. It's a record that I don't think anyone's in any danger of equaling. Maybe Kurt Busiek, maybe Mark Waid, but distantly. But it ruins stuff like this. I mean, what are you supposed to do with any of this? Or with Wagner, for God's sake. So I can't recommend the Eternal Saga. I don't know if Mike is going to recommend it, but you're not going to understand a word of it. Even if you're a Marvel Comics fan, you're only going to stand every third word. And there's not enough else that most of the rest of the stuff that happens in it is just dumb. It's just dorky. At least the Epic Collection I think, reprints pages from the Handbook of the Marvel Universe that clearly delineate that the Eternals are much weaker than the Asgardians. Icarus, the main Eternal, can lift a ton. Basically, 1.5 tons. Whereas Thor can lift 100 tons. Thor's girlfriend, Sif, can lift 50 tons. So at least we clarify that this isn't just a race of Kryptonians. But I'd rather that we not clarify them at all. I'd rather that we just ignore them. So maybe we've seen the last of them. I don't know what the status of the Eternals is now. They're movie bombed. I think they had a limited run comic book with great artwork by John Romita Jr., but fans didn't like it. So maybe we will reach an era where we will just forget that they happened. Most of us have done a very good job of wholesale forgetting the things that we did in the 70s. Let's let the Eternals be part of that. But anyway, I'm going to wrap this up. That is your comic for today, the Eternal Saga. But I'll be back. Thank you, BookTube.